In the final months of World War II, as Allied forces advanced into the heart of the Third Reich, plans were being drawn up in Washington for a new front, not on the battlefields, but in laboratories. The priority was clear: to secure the scientific talent that had driven the Nazi regime's most feared innovations. The war had proven that German technology could make a decisive difference. V-1 and V-2 missiles, precision-guided weapons with lethal accuracy, had terrorized Europe. With the post-war era looming, the United States feared that France, or above all the Soviet Union, might get ahead in the race to recruit these experts. The onset of the Cold War only heightened that urgency. This was how Operation Paperclip was born, a federal program overseen by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. Its goal was to integrate these scientists into projects in aeronautics, weaponry, and later, space exploration. Between 1945 and 1962, around 1,500 specialists from Germany and Austria arrived on American soil, many of them later becoming US citizens. Selection was based on a registry compiled by engineer Werner Osenberg, listing roughly 15,000 names. In the war's final days, documents from that list were thrown into a toilet at the University of Bonn. Rescued by Allied forces, they became the foundation for recruitment. Files marked with a paperclip received only a superficial review, even if they belonged to members of the Nazi Party or the SS. Among the most famous was Wernher von Braun, architect of the V-2 and an SS officer. After working for the army at Fort Bliss and in Huntsville, he was transferred to NASA in 1960, where he played a key role in the Apollo program. Kurt Debus, also a former SS member, became the first director of the Kennedy Space Center. Not all escaped controversy. Georg Ricci, linked to the use of slave labor at Mittelwerk, was extradited to Germany in 1947. Arthur Rudolph, a collaborator in V-2 production, later oversaw the manufacture of the Saturn V, but in the 1980s renounced his US citizenship to avoid a war crimes trial. Hubertus Strughold, a pioneer in space medicine, was later accused of participating in medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. On June 20th, 1945, the State Department authorized the secret transfer of von Braun and his team under neutral language. On the surface, it appeared to be a routine administrative procedure. In practice, it meant suspending post-war moral judgment to secure a strategic advantage before others could claim it. Operation Paperclip remained shrouded in strict confidentiality. Its goal was to integrate experts in aeronautics, chemistry, or medicine into sensitive US projects. To make this possible, files were altered, compromising affiliations were erased, and profiles were adjusted to meet immigration requirements. The aim was to turn unacceptable figures into candidates fit to serve on the new strategic stage. At the same time, other operations took an opposite course. Among them was Keelhaul, driven by the Allies, which involved the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens to an uncertain fate. The coexistence of these initiatives highlighted the contradictions of the time. While some were protected for their knowledge, others were returned against their will. The race for German talent intensified even before the final surrender. Washington and Moscow competed for access to the Reich's nuclear program and its advances in biological and chemical weaponry. The Soviets dismantled entire factories, transporting facilities piece by piece. Faced with this, the United States realized that the true resource was not the machines, but the people. The key to locating them came with the Osenberg list. This registry allowed vital engineers and technicians to be identified. From Switzerland, Alan Dulles vetted their backgrounds and softened problematic references to facilitate their transfer. Capturing them was not easy. Many used false identities or hid within improvised networks. However, they preferred surrendering to the Americans rather than falling into Soviet hands. While Stalin employed around 2,000 scientists without granting them privileges, Washington offered residence, citizenship, and immunity for past actions. After capture, they were taken to a castle near Frankfurt, where they were meticulously interrogated. Their sanitized statements were accepted, and the most compromising evidence vanished from the files. The name Paperclip originated from the clips marking the of interest files, which were only superficially reviewed. In September 1945, von Braun arrived in the United States along with plans, components, and machinery that, according to prior agreements, were supposed to go to the Soviet Union. This was not an isolated case. Parallel programs in the United Kingdom and the USSR replicated the strategy of seizing German knowledge. Among those recruited was Hubertus Strughold, whose future recognition as the father of space medicine contrasted starkly with the experiments he had overseen at Dachau. Many of these specialists were assigned to isolated sites, such as Fort Bliss in Texas or White Sands in New Mexico, where they could work away from public scrutiny. Over time, they settled in Huntsville, Alabama, which would come to be known as Rocket City. In the eyes of society, they were simply German engineers helping the United States advance. In reality, they were shielded by a system that protected them from accountability. While Holocaust survivors continued to demand justice, these men built careers, received honors, and raised families in American suburbs. In Huntsville, von Braun became a respected figure, supporting local schools, integrating into community life, and attending religious services. His past as a Nazi officer was overshadowed by the image of a visionary driving national prestige. The dynamic shifted with the Cold War. In 1957, the launch of Sputnik triggered alarm in Washington. For the first time, the United States perceived a direct threat from space. Rocket technology became the new front in the rivalry with Moscow. Von Braun's team assumed a central role in the newly established NASA. While the Soviets sent Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961, the United States redoubled its efforts. John F. Kennedy's speech, setting the goal of reaching the moon, was embraced by those engineers as a direct challenge. 8 years later, Apollo 11 achieved that triumph, though the rocket that made it possible descended directly from a weapon that had once spread terror across Europe. For decades, the program remained hidden from public view. It was not until the 1970s, amid a climate of mistrust fueled by Vietnam and Watergate, that journalists and scholars began to reveal its true scale. In 1985, a televised report reignited controversy and prompted official investigations into former files. Arthur Rudolph, responsible for Saturn V production, was expelled from the country. Others avoided trial entirely, dying before they could be held accountable. The controversy did not disappear. The technical achievements derived from Paperclip propelled space exploration, medicine, and modern weaponry, but the ethical cost was incalculable. Historians and experts continue to debate whether it was a necessary evil or a surrender of the founding principles of the United States. What is certain is that progress and moral responsibility rarely walked hand in hand in this story. To understand how it came to this, one must go back to the final days of the war. On May 2, 1945, just hours before Germany's surrender, a group of rocket specialists led by Wernher von Braun and General Walter Dornberger voluntarily surrendered to US forces. Von Braun trusted that his expertise would make him indispensable to his captors, and he was not wrong. During the initial interrogations, he presented a report that went beyond military technology. It described trips to the moon, orbital stations, and reconnaissance satellites. His captors instantly recognized the value of these projections. Shortly thereafter, von Braun and 112 of his collaborators were transferred to Fort Bliss, Texas, under close supervision to prevent any abduction attempts by other powers. There, the V-2s ceased to be weapons and became test vehicles for the nascent era of space exploration. The beginnings were fraught with setbacks. In 1947, the launch of the Hermes 2 rocket ended in failure. The projectile veered off course and fell on Mexican territory, leaving a massive crater but causing no casualties. Despite these stumbles, von Braun's prominence began to extend beyond the military sphere. He participated in educational programs produced by Disney, where he shared his vision of the space future and even collaborated on the design of Tomorrowland, projecting an optimistic vision of technological conquest. In 1967, his team unveiled the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built. A year later, the Apollo 8 mission achieved the first manned orbit around the moon. Between 1969 and 1972, 6 expeditions landed on the lunar surface. The Apollo 11 moon landing solidified American supremacy and turned von Braun into a symbol of that victory, despite his past in the Nazi war machine. The technical triumph was undeniable, but it also left a lingering question. To what extent was the United States' space success built on a past it preferred not to confront directly? This background helps explain the race to seize German knowledge after the war, a struggle that took on the flavor of a spy novel. Army counterintelligence corps documents reveal that, between the fall of 1945 and the spring of 1946, agents scoured the ruins of the Reich with a precise goal: to secure the rare and selected mines responsible for rockets, jet engines, electric submarines, and chemical weapons. In theory, the occupying powers had agreed on common rules for managing this search. In practice, each country acted independently. French operatives kidnapped scientists in the US zone, British forces clashed physically with American soldiers, and Soviet agents used decoys to recruit collaborators. The hunt for specialists became a new front in devastated Europe. Washington viewed these men as strategic prizes. Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace convinced Truman to authorize the operation with a simple argument: they are the only reparations we are likely to get. Thus, the pursuit of experts became an absolute priority, and the atmosphere in occupied Germany took on a Wild West character. Kidnappings, bribes, and clashes between intelligence services compounded the post-war chaos. Although today the story is known as Operation Paperclip, its original name was Project Overcast. It began with the idea of temporarily transferring German engineers and technicians to aid in the war against Japan. Initially, it was meant to last only a few months. But when the conflict in Asia ended in August 1945, the initiative did not stop. It simply transformed into a long-term program aimed at securing a lasting advantage over the Soviet Union. Over time, von Braun's team in Huntsville became the public face of the project, but it represented only a portion of the whole. By the mid-1950s, the Air Force had recruited the majority of experts, while others were absorbed by the Navy, universities, and private companies. Space exploration, although crucial in later propaganda, was not the initial goal. The priority remained the arms race: supersonic aerodynamics, guidance systems, and missile propulsion. The integration of this knowledge accelerated technological advances, but also concealed files that should have brought several of these men before the Nuremberg tribunal. When their records were declassified in the 1980s, the debate was no longer merely military or scientific, it was profoundly moral. More recent investigations, such as those by Annie Jacobsen, revealed the full scope of the program. Official documents, German archives, and first-hand testimonies confirmed that Paperclip encompassed far more than the well-known cases of von Braun or Debus. Among the lesser-known episodes was the interception of the U-234 submarine in May 1945, carrying a cargo of missile blueprints, bomb prototypes, and over half a ton of uranium oxide. Its capture illustrated just how much German knowledge had become the most coveted prize of the post-war period. The spectrum of disciplines absorbed was vast. In chemistry, Gerhard Schrader and Otto Ambros developed nerve agents such as tabun and sarin. In medicine, Hubertus Strughold experimented with life support systems, even sending a monkey on the tip of a V-2 as a test for future human spaceflight. In biology, Kurt Blohm was recruited for programs in bacteriological warfare. It was not just applied science. General Reinhard Gehlen, former head of Nazi intelligence against the Soviet Union, was incorporated into the US Army and later the CIA, leading an organization composed of hundreds of former agents operating in occupied Germany. This network became one of the fundamental assets at the onset of the Cold War. Even the CIA expanded this logic with a new dimension. In 1949, it created the Scientific Intelligence Office, paving the way for projects such as Bluebird and later MKUltra. There, techniques of mind control and psychoactive drugs like LSD were explored, often in experiments conducted without consent. The most notorious case was the death of researcher Frank Olson, secretly dosed and thrown into a maelstrom of suspicions that were never fully clarified. The ethical dilemma was constant. For some, the choice seemed simple: execute these men for their crimes or incorporate them to confront the Soviet Union. Time and again, the scale tipped toward strategic utility, leaving unanswered the question of how far technological power could be bought at the cost of justice. The initial captures focused on Saxony and Thuringia, regions where the Peenemünde Research Center operated. Many of the specialists listed in the Osenberg list worked there, and it was crucial to remove them from the path of the Red Army before they fell into Soviet hands. At first, the plan was limited to interrogations, but it soon became clear that their expertise could prove decisive. Thus, in May 1945, figures such as Herbert Wagner, inventor of glider bombs, and Eberhard Ries, responsible for V-2 production, began arriving in the United States. With the war over and the confrontation with Moscow already underway, the operation received political backing at the highest level. In September 1946, Truman officially authorized the program, fully aware that many participants had been members of the Nazi Party or even SS officers. Reports of slave labor at facilities like Mittelwerk were ignored in favor of their strategic value. Only one, Georg Ricke, was sent back to Germany for trial. He was acquitted. Others, such as Walter Schreiber, implicated in medical experiments, managed to escape to South America with US assistance. The contrast between their pasts and the honors they received in their new lives is striking. Wernher von Braun ended up leading the design of the Saturn V that carried astronauts to the moon in 1969, and his name appears in the International Space Hall of Fame. Adolf Bussmann introduced the swept wing that transformed jet aviation. Hubertus Strughold, long considered the father of space medicine, was celebrated until after his death, evidence of his participation in human experiments came to light. The material benefits were immense. It is estimated that the patents and industrial processes attributable to Paperclip reached a value of $10 billion. Yet most of its key figures never faced a tribunal for their roles in the Third Reich. On the contrary, they died decorated, honored, and enshrined as central figures in American science. Meanwhile, other Allied teams operated on a different front. In November 1944, while the streets of Strasbourg were still under German fire, physicist Samuel Goudsmit and his Alsos mission team were examining documents in an apartment abandoned by virologist Eugen Hagen. Among personal letters and memoranda, they found evidence that experiments were being conducted on healthy human subjects. Hagen had requested prisoners suitable for experiments, a request that revealed the Third Reich's pursuit of vaccines to protect its own forces before releasing viruses against its enemies. That discovery was a window into the abyss. Names like Kurt Blome, responsible for the biological weapons program, and Walter Schreiber, in charge of vaccines, emerged as high-priority targets. What Goudsmit could not have imagined then was that some of these men would end up working under a new banner in the service of the United States. At the same time, in opposite settings, the Nazi regime celebrated its advances. At Wala Castle, Albert Speer decorated von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and other engineers as V-2 rockets lifted off toward Antwerp. Each impact was a reminder that Hitler could still strike with weapons no Allied fighter could intercept. But the real secret lay underground, in the Mittelwerk plant, where tens of thousands of slaves were forced to assemble rockets under inhuman conditions. Without ventilation, water, or light, they worked until they died. From those tunnels emerged both rockets and corpses. Allied obsession became twofold: to stop that machinery and to seize the knowledge that could define future warfare. And when the Reich collapsed, its engineers realized that their expertise was a lifeline. On the very day Hitler took his own life in his bunker, hundreds of kilometers to the south, several of his most valuable technicians voluntarily surrendered to US forces. In the outskirts of Hamburg, Siegfried Knemeyer was captured by British soldiers after fleeing his vehicle. Further south, in an alpine refuge, von Braun and Dornberger waited confidently. Staying at a mountain hotel, they followed the news by radio and sent Magnus von Braun, the engineer's younger brother, to negotiate their surrender. They did not present themselves as criminals, but as men of science with an invaluable product, V-2 technology. The scene of their capture quickly became a media spectacle. Photographs showed them smiling, shaking hands with US soldiers. For intelligence officers, the attitude was infuriating. Wernher von Braun behaved more like a distinguished guest than a prisoner, yet his strategic value was beyond question. Meanwhile, other Nazi leaders fell into Allied hands. Albert Speer was arrested in Flensburg. Himmler committed suicide after being identified in a prisoner camp. Hermann Schmitz was found in Heidelberg with evidence linking him to Auschwitz, and Otto Ambros, responsible for chemical weapons, presented himself as a mere civil chemist, concealing his true identity. The interrogations revealed a repeated pattern. All denied responsibility, minimized their roles, and offered themselves as indispensable experts for the future. The fate of the German scientists held at Dustbin was uncertain. No one knew whether they would be integrated into future US government projects or tried as war criminals. At the Ashcan detention center, where the Nazi leadership was held, the outlook appeared even grimmer. The prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials faced a monumental task, turning into legal evidence what everyone knew but was barely documented. Prosecutor Telford Taylor recalled that at the outset, they lacked solid proof, and the burden fell on interrogators like John Doliboa, tasked with obtaining direct confessions. The prisoners resisted speaking, and many conspired among themselves to conceal information. To break the silence, Colonel Burton Andrus, commander of Ashcan, gathered 52 high-ranking officials and screened footage filmed at Buchenwald. Before the projection began, he warned them, "We know this happened. Some of you ordered it. Others participated. We are not showing this to inform you, but so you understand that we also know." Reactions varied. Hans Frank could barely contain his nausea. Joachim von Ribbentrop quietly left the room. Albert Kesselring went pale. Goering feigned boredom, and Julius Streicher simply twisted his hands. When it ended, no one spoke. Only Walter Funk, president of the Reichsbank, requested to see Andrus. Through sobs, he confessed to ordering gold to be extracted from prisoners' mouths to augment the bank's reserves. It was a harrowing moment, though at Nuremberg he denied everything. Faced with persistent silence, Andrus devised a bold plan. He selected 4 prisoners prone to criticizing their peers, Goering, von Papen, Kesselring and Admiral Horthy, and secretly moved them to a house wired with hidden microphones. At first, the recordings seemed promising, but the operation soon faltered. Rain disrupted the conversations, and when the prisoners realized they were barely 3 kilometers from Ashcan, they reacted with fury. In August 1945, Ashcan closed its doors, and the prisoners were transferred to Oberursel, where they would begin drafting intelligence reports for the US Army. During that journey, Doliboy witnessed an unforgettable scene. His convoy crossed trucks loaded with decomposing corpses, victims of Dachau, being transported for burial. Decades later, he still recalled the unbearable stench and how in that moment he fully grasped the magnitude of Nazi horror. Shortly thereafter, he received a special assignment to accompany the senior leaders to Nuremberg. Among them was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Main Security Office. Andrus ordered Doliboy to remain handcuffed to him during the flight and to shoot if he attempted to escape. Kaltenbrunner made no move but tried to justify himself. He admitted hating Jews but denied ordering their extermination. Like so many others, he claimed he was merely following orders. Doliboy listened without responding, aware that these words were a last-ditch attempt to save himself. The Ashcan prisoners finally arrived in Nuremberg, where most would be tried and sentenced to death. One image stayed with Doliboy. Alongside the fence of the makeshift detention center, a Luxembourger repeatedly shouted, "Hallo Meyer! How's everything in Berlin?" Mocking Goering, who years earlier had vowed that if the Allies bombed the capital, he would go by the name Meyer. Now, reduced to a defeated prisoner, the Reichsmarschall had no answer. In the same days that the top Nazi leaders were executed in Nuremberg and their ashes scattered in a river, decisions of an entirely different nature were being made in Washington. Under-Secretary of State Dean Acheson discussed new procedures for Operation Paperclip with Samuel Klaus. A secret memorandum established that visa applications would no longer be reviewed by diplomats in Europe. Instead, the task would be under the control of the US Army on American soil. Within weeks, more than 200 German technicians and specialists were already at US military bases. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Soviets leaked news of the program through their Berlin press, and the American public began to discover, with surprise and unease, that men who had worked for Hitler were now living in Dayton, Ohio, or Fort Bliss, Texas. The War Department then chose to control the narrative. An open house was organized at Wright Field, where journalists, photographers, and radio crews could see several scientists presented in a favorable light. One demonstrated a parachute in front of the cameras. Another displayed a model of a futuristic delta-wing aircraft. Some were photographed strolling through shops or playing chess in their free time. The official message was clear. These were brilliant experts, detached from Nazism, family men whose work was vital to national security. Yet the files told a different story. Some engineers had led assemblies in SA uniforms or participated in the burning of synagogues. A technician specializing in aircraft engines had been linked to the SS and the looting of Jewish property. Despite the warnings, the Air Force chose to keep them, considering their knowledge too valuable to let slip away. The revelations sparked intense public debate. Editorials, associations, and prominent figures protested vehemently. Rabbi Stephen Wise, president of the American Jewish Congress, denounced the contradiction of rewarding former regime collaborators while thousands of displaced Jews remained crowded in refugee camps. Eleanor Roosevelt and Albert Einstein joined the criticism, calling for a 10-year suspension on German admissions. Even a group of writers and journalists gathered under the Society for the Prevention of World War III compared the importation of scientists to complicity in the Reich's crimes. Despite these voices of protest, the machinery continued. By 1946, Wright Field housed more than 100 specialists, many in an isolated environment that soon degenerated into internal tensions. It was there that Georg Ricke appeared, a tunnel engineer and former director of the underground Nordhausen plant. His expertise interested the US Army, which sought to learn from the Reich's shelter systems and fortified factories. However, testimonies from other engineers implicated him in ordering public executions of prisoners in the Mittelwerk tunnels. The allegations began circulating discreetly among American officers. While some insisted they were personal rivalries among colleagues, others warned that a war crime was being covered up. Ricke's case eventually became a problem that threatened to destabilize the entire operation. Following complaints collected by Major Eugene Smith and testimonies from engineers describing public executions at Mittelwerk, the investigation reached Washington. At that very moment in Germany, a stroke of luck accelerated events. William Almans, a Dutch investigator dedicated to tracking SS officers, discovered in an American newspaper Ricke's name linked to a citizenship application. He immediately realized that the former Nordhausen director was not missing, as many had believed, but living under military custody in the United States. In May 1947, an arrest warrant was issued. Documents confirmed that the man employed at Wright Field and the one responsible for executions in the V2 tunnels were the same person. Ricke was returned to Germany, where he became a defendant in the Dora Nordhausen trial. There, 19 former officers and executives were prosecuted for the deaths of more than 20,000 prisoners subjected to forced labor, starvation, and torture. The trial, held in an SS barracks adjacent to the Dachau camp, lasted nearly 5 months. Although 15 of the defendants were convicted, Ricke was ultimately acquitted. The decision was controversial, but even more so was what followed. The US Army classified the trial records in their entirety. For 40 years, the proceedings remained inaccessible to the public. The secrecy protected, among other things, the identities and pasts of more than 100 scientists already working at Fort Bliss. Ricke's acquittal did not halt the program. Just weeks later, new Reich technicians arrived in Ohio. Among them was Siegfried Knemeyer, a celebrated test pilot and one of Goering and Speer's favorite engineers. He joined the Communications and Navigation Laboratory of the newly created US Air Force, quickly earning a reputation as a brilliant innovator. Alongside him was Walter Dornberger, former head of all the Reich's rocket programs. The British had labelled him a first-order danger, yet in July 1947 he signed a contract under Paperclip. His strategic vision, outlined in classified reports, unambiguously argued that the United States needed to adopt military organizational methods close to authoritarian models in order to surpass the Soviet Union in the arms race. At the same time, opposition was growing within the American academic world. The Federation of American Scientists warned that a dangerous path was being taken, driven more by military urgency than by ethical principles. Figures of enormous prestige, such as Hans Bethe and Albert Einstein, publicly denounced the mass importation of Nazi technicians, cautioning against the risk of allowing their ideas or loyalties to penetrate universities and research centers. Their words posed a troubling question. Was it acceptable to advance science at any cost, even if that cost meant opening the door to those who had served a genocidal regime. Meanwhile, at Fort Bliss and Wright Field, the scientists' lives continued under discreet surveillance. Some were caught in black market schemes, others had their ties to the SS or the exploitation of slave labor in Reich factories exposed. Yet the majority continued working, protected by a system that preferred to silence the past rather than hinder the development of rockets, radar, or experimental aircraft. In the decades following the war, the official narrative began to crumble. Starting in the 1970s, a series of events decisively altered public perception of Nazis who had taken refuge in the United States. War crimes trials that had remained hidden for years, combined with congressional hearings revealing the negligence of immigration authorities, led to the creation of a new Department of Justice office dedicated exclusively to investigating them. Soon after, the television broadcast of the miniseries Holocaust brought a stark image of the extermination into millions of American homes for the first time, forcing many to confront a reality that had previously seemed distant. It was in this climate that a young Harvard student, Eli Rosenbaum, stumbled upon two books by chance in a Cambridge bookstore. The first, written by French resistance member Jean Michel, recounted the harsh experiences of Dora prisoners, denouncing the silence of the scientists who, after the war, deliberately omitted what had occurred in the Nordhausen tunnels. The second was The Rocket Team, a work celebrating the achievements of the V-2 engineers and including testimonies from Arthur Rudolph, presented as a hero of the US space program, yet with no mention of his role in the Third Reich's slave labor system. That contradiction left a lasting impression on Rosenbaum. Later, becoming a Department of Justice prosecutor, he launched an investigation that culminated in Rudolph's expulsion in 1984. After nearly 4 decades of honors and recognition, the Saturn V architect quietly left the country, forced to renounce his citizenship to avoid a war crimes trial. The case triggered a domino effect. Journalists and scholars began using the Freedom of Information Act to access previously classified documents. The work of reporters such as Linda Hunt revealed that Paperclip had not been composed solely of nominal Nazis, as the official version claimed, but of men closely tied to the Reich's criminal apparatus. However, resistance to accepting this truth was persistent. While the Justice Department advanced on certain fronts, other institutions sought to preserve convenient myths. Some of the doctors who had conducted lethal experiments continued to be honored in universities and military bases until public pressure gradually forced their names to be removed. The passage of time did not halt the emergence of new revelations. In the 1990s, Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, requiring the declassification of millions of pages of documents. Reports from that interagency committee were unequivocal. This was not a few rotten apples. The recruitment of figures directly involved in crimes had been a deliberate policy, maintained throughout the Cold War. Even later, well into the 21st century, unexpected connections surfaced. Medical investigations in England linked chemist Otto Ambros, released from prison and reintegrated into industry, to the thalidomide tragedy, a drug that caused deformities in thousands of newborns. Other documents revealed that doctors such as Hubertus Strughold had authorized experiments on epileptic children during the war, yet continued to be honored for decades in space and medical institutions. The pattern repeated itself: hidden files, prolonged tributes, and truths that only emerged when it was too late. Each revelation forced a reconsideration of the same question. What ultimately prevails, the scientific work of these men or the weight of their crimes? Some, like Theodor Benzinger, entered history for minor medical inventions, while their military contributions remained classified. Others, like Kurt Debus, were celebrated at the heart of the US space program, despite their pasts in the SS. Ambiguity became the true legacy of Paperclip. Ultimately, the fundamental question remains open. Physicist Benzinger devoted his life to studying entropy, convinced that nothing lasts forever. But survivors like Gerhard Mashkowski offer another answer. What endures is the memory etched in the skin, the indelible mark of Auschwitz that demands remembrance. Against the temptation of myths, what truly persists is the truth that refuses to be silenced. The story of Operation Paperclip leads to a paradox that is difficult to ignore. The logic of the Cold War transformed executioners into collaborators, and the ashes of the Second World War became fertile ground on which the United States sowed its space race and technological power. It was not just about rockets or patents. What was at stake was the very definition of justice in times of fear. The need to secure an advantage over Moscow justified silence, erased records, and granted impunity to those who, in another context, would have faced a tribunal. Thus, the nation that proclaimed itself the embodiment of freedom integrated figures who had prospered under the swastika. The legacy is twofold. On one hand, humanity achieved extraordinary leaps: satellites, orbital flights, aerospace medicine, and even the arrival of man on the moon. Advances that inspired generations and redefined the horizons of the 20th century. Yet at the same time, that very achievement rested on foundations corroded by moral ambiguity. Every launch, every applause, carried a latent question. What is the price of progress when it is purchased with silence over irreparable crimes? Decades later, when the archives were declassified, it became clear that the story had never been linear. Not all were visionary geniuses, nor all mere criminals. They were men caught in the ambitions of two empires, pieces on a board where historical truth was subordinated to strategy. The revelation did not erase their contributions, but it forced them to be seen in a different light, one of contradiction, one of discomfort. Today, looking at the present, the echo of Paperclip resonates strongly. It reminds us that science, however brilliant, is never neutral. It depends on the hands that wield it and the purposes to which it is directed. The dilemma of those years remains. How far can one compromise in the name of security, and what happens when principles become a currency of exchange?